From the very first moment Pope Leo XIV stepped out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, a quiet hush fell over the crowd below. Cameras flashed, bells rang, and the world watched as history unfolded. On the surface, it looked like the familiar beginning of a new chapter in the Church's story, a new pope greeting the faithful. But for those who had studied the whispers of old prophecies and the deep traditions of Catholic mystics, this wasn't just another papal introduction. It felt like something more, something ancient, something foretold. There was a prophecy, one not often mentioned in Sunday sermons, but long passed down among scholars, believers, and curious minds. A vision connected to a saint from centuries ago, Saint Malachy of Ireland. Some call it a legend, others a warning. But ever since Pope Leo appeared, people have started to look at it again with fresh eyes. Not just because of who he is, but because of when he arrived, and what was written long ago that seems to echo right now. So let's ask the question that's hanging silently in the background. What if this prophecy wasn't just medieval imagination? What if it was pointing to this exact moment? What if what Saint Malachy wrote almost 1,000 years ago is starting to play out in real time under the great dome of St. Peter's, with this very Pope? To understand why this idea is sending chills through church historians, and even ordinary believers, we have to go back to the beginning. To who Saint Malachy was, and to what he saw. Saint Malachy was a 12th century Irish archbishop known for his deep prayer life and simple holiness. During a pilgrimage to Rome, tradition says he received a vision, something that didn't just apply to his own time, but to the entire future of the papacy. What he saw, according to the story, were 112 popes. Not by name, but by mysterious Latin mottos, each one describing a pope's character, heritage, or mission. This vision wasn't shared right away. The list remained hidden for centuries, locked away in the quiet vaults of the church. It wasn't until the late 16th century that it suddenly resurfaced. A monk named Arnold de Wyan revealed it to the public during a conclave, claiming it came straight from the hand of Saint Malachy himself. Since then, it's become one of the Church's most debated mysteries. What makes it even more captivating is how, looking back, many of the phrases seem to strangely fit the popes they supposedly describe. Some call it coincidence. Others see it as a divine roadmap. The Latin phrases appear to hint at details, coats of arms, birthplaces, spiritual themes, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct. And now, the list has reached its end. Entry number 112. Unlike the other entries, which used poetic Latin lines to describe each pope, this final one is different. It doesn't offer a clever motto or hint at a birthplace. Instead, it gives a serious warning. It speaks of a shepherd, one who will lead the faithful through a time of great testing, a time of trial. For many, this is the part that feels most unsettling, because they believe this final shepherd might now be here. That Pope Leo XIV may not have just stepped into the shoes of his predecessor, he may have stepped into prophecy. The final line of Saint Malachy's prophecy ends with a mysterious image, one that speaks of the city of 7 hills, an ancient name for Rome, and finishes not with a motto, but with a warning. For years, many wondered if the prophecy had already come to pass, especially during the time of Pope Francis. But with his passing and the unexpected rise of Pope Leo XIV, attention has returned, sharper than before. Could it be that the prophecy wasn't fulfilled then but now? Some believe Pope Leo might be the one Saint Malachy truly foresaw, not to lead through chaos or ruin, but through a time of deep reflection and spiritual testing. A time not of collapse, but of cleansing. While Pope Leo has never spoken publicly about the prophecy, his election has sparked conversations across the church, from seminaries and theological institutes to online forums and quiet parish discussions. His background is humble. Born in Chicago, shaped by years of missionary work in Peru, Pope Leo is seen not as a figure of power, but of service. Those who know his story describe a man who walks with the poor, listens before he speaks, and lives his faith in action, not just words. And it's this simplicity, this steady, pastoral heart that some say mirrors the figure in Malachy's final vision. A shepherd for difficult days. But before we go further, it must be said clearly. The Church has never treated Saint Malachy's prophecy as official teaching. It is a private revelation, one that invites interpretation, not one that demands belief. And yet, people are still drawn to it. Because the list ends in a way that feels less like fear and more like a turning point. Not destruction, but decision. Not an ending, but a call to deeper faith. That's why so many are now watching Pope Leo with fresh eyes. Not to ask if he's the last pope, but to ask, is he the right pope for this moment in history? And that question only grows louder. Because something about this moment feels significant. His election, on the 13th of March, in the year 2025, didn't just bring a new leader to the Church. It brought a sense that something larger might be unfolding, something that touches both heaven and earth. Pope Leo is the first pope to come from the order of St. Augustine, a religious path deeply rooted in community, humility, and service. His years in Latin America gave him a closeness to the people, especially those often forgotten. And his voice, gentle but firm, has already made an impact. Not because it's controversial, but because it's clear. Not because it shouts, but because it listens. Yes, many popes before him led the Church through crisis and change. But there's something unique about this one. It's not just where he's from, or which order shaped him. It's how he carries himself. From his very first days as Pope, Leo XIV has focused on healing, listening, and guiding through presence, not through headlines or declarations, but through steady, faithful action. Still, the Church he now leads is facing one of its most complex moments. The world is shifting quickly, and Catholics everywhere are asking big questions. How should the Church support families? What role should tradition play in a modern world? How can the Church walk with those in difficult or unusual life situations? These aren't easy questions. But they are being asked, and the Church is listening. Some of these conversations became more visible during the time of Pope Francis, especially with the release of Amoris Laetitia, a document that encouraged deeper compassion and pastoral care. While many welcomed its approach, others felt it needed further clarification. And this is not unusual. Throughout history, the Church has always faced theological tension during councils, during reforms, during every age. These aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of a Church that lives, grows, and seeks God with seriousness. Back in 2017, a group of clergy and scholars even wrote an open letter expressing their concerns not out of defiance, but out of deep respect for the faith. And that's something important to understand. In Catholic tradition, respectful debate and theological discussion are not threats. They're part of the journey toward truth. Now, with Pope Leo XIV leading the way, a sense of hope seems to be rising again. His peaceful way of speaking, his closeness to the poor, and his deep inner faith are touching people around the world. His time as Pope may not be filled with dramatic changes, but perhaps that's the point. He brings something quieter, something deeper. A return to the basics of faith. A time not of revolution, but of renewal. And for many, that might be exactly what this moment needs. Pope Leo XIV doesn't feel like a break from the past. Instead, he feels like a bridge connecting what was with what could be. He moves with the rhythm of tradition, but carries a calm vision of what lies ahead. So if Saint Malachy's prophecy truly does speak to this moment in time, maybe it's not a message of fear as some once thought. Maybe it isn't about endings at all. Maybe it's about a sacred pause, a still moment between chapters, inviting the Church to remember what it was always meant to be. Perhaps this moment isn't a storm, but a sunrise. Pope Leo's quiet arrival might be the beginning of a softer kind of change. Not one driven by noise or disruption, but by quiet strength, prayer, and patience. And maybe, just maybe, the prophecy isn't a warning, it's a reminder. A call to return to what matters most. Not to fear what's coming, but to move forward with steady faith, trusting that God is still leading His Church, one prayer at a time. To understand the weight of this shift, we need to glance back just for a moment to the fall of 2013. It was just months after the beginning of another widely watched pontificate. On October 19th of that year, a Catholic bishop named Bernard Fellay, known for his strong traditional views, shared a personal reflection that caught attention in some circles. In his message, he expressed concerns. He believed certain changes in the Church might mark the start of a more spiritually difficult time for Christians worldwide. Some took his comments to heart. Others saw them more as a personal opinion or symbolic caution. But what made that moment notable wasn't just his words, it was the fact that the Church, once again, was being asked to look inward, to reflect on its identity, its mission, and how it could remain steady while the world around it kept shifting. And this has always been part of Catholic life. The Church spans countries, languages, and cultures. It's natural for voices within it to offer different thoughts, some more contemplative, some more pastoral, others more doctrinal. These conversations don't mean division. They mean that the Church is alive, growing, listening. It's also important to remember something else. The role of the Pope means different things to different people. While some may feel uncertain about specific teachings or pastoral changes, millions of others feel deeply moved by a Pope who speaks of mercy, of simplicity, of love that goes beyond walls. Each Pope brings his own heart to the same mission, carrying the gospel to every corner of the world. Over the years, the popes have lifted up different themes: justice, care for the poor, dialogue between faiths, and the sacred duty of protecting creation. These aren't just ideas, they've become living invitations to people everywhere. Whether in bustling cities or quiet villages, the message has remained the same. Every person matters. Every life is sacred. Back in early 2014, a global survey on values revealed something surprising. A large part of the world, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, saw the Pope not only as a church leader, but as a moral voice for all people. He was seen as someone who could bring people together across political, cultural, and religious lines. From the neighborhoods of South America to the crowded streets of Asia and Europe, the papacy wasn't just being followed by the faithful. It was being watched by many people from all walks of life, drawn in not by theology alone, but by the witness of compassion, the actions of service, and the courage to care. And now, as Pope Leo XIV quietly begins his journey, that same global gaze turns once more toward Rome, not looking for a man to perform miracles, but for a shepherd who walks gently, prays deeply, and reminds the world that holiness is not loud, but faithful. Like any institution that has stood for centuries, the Catholic Church has always been a place where different voices rise. These voices don't signal division, they reflect a church that is still very much alive. Throughout its history, there have been moments of deep prayer, long debates, and heartfelt letters, each trying to answer one question: how best to follow the gospel in a changing world. Over time, those letters, whether full of praise or concern, have become part of a sacred tradition. One such letter made headlines in August of 2018. It came from a retired archbishop who poured his heart into an 11-page message. It wasn't written to attack, it was written to awaken. He spoke not just to church leaders, but to the whole community, calling for honesty, spiritual renewal, and a deeper return to the truth. Reactions were mixed. Some saw it as a necessary voice. Others felt it went too far. But either way, it reminded people of something important. The Church does not hide from questions. It walks through them, always seeking light. It is, and always has been, a family of believers trying to stay faithful across every generation, no matter how complex the times may be. Today, those conversations haven't stopped. From quiet pews to bustling parishes, from YouTube videos to theology blogs, people are still asking, where is the Church heading? What role should it play in a world that's shifting so quickly? But instead of being stuck in arguments, many are choosing another path. They're turning toward discernment, toward prayerful reflection. They're asking not how to win debates, but how to hold on to truth while reaching others with love. And once again, in the middle of all this reflection, the name of Saint Malachy returns. His mysterious list of 112 popes has fascinated scholars for hundreds of years. Each entry, written in Latin, holds a symbol, a phrase, something that seems to describe each pope in a unique way. And while interpretations have varied, some titles stand out more than others. For instance, the pope listed right before the final entry, the one many believe points to Pope Benedict XVI, was described with the words Gloria Olivi, or the glory of the olive. Some link this to themes of peace, others to monastic life, even to the olive branch from Scripture. The meaning, as always, is open. But that's what makes the list so enduring. It doesn't just predict, it invites wonder. Whether you see it as divine insight or a historical curiosity, it draws people deeper into the mystery of how God works through time. There's even a moment from the Church's past that shows just how seriously people took these symbols. In 1958, just before the conclave that would elect Pope John XXIII, Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York did something unexpected. He rented a boat, filled it with sheep, and sailed down the Tiber River in Rome. Many saw it as a symbolic nod to the prophecy, specifically the line about a shepherd and a sailor. Was it a gesture of deep faith? Or a bit of light-hearted theater? Maybe both. But it showed one thing clearly. People were paying attention. These old prophecies still held a place in people's imaginations and in their hopes. So now we ask again, what are we meant to take from Saint Malachy's words? Is the final line a sign of ending, or a quiet call to rediscover what the Church truly is? With Pope Leo XIV now standing in the place of Saint Peter, these questions feel more alive than ever. But they don't have to cause fear. In fact, they might lead us somewhere better, not toward predictions, but toward trust. Not toward endings, but toward God's quiet plan, still unfolding. Perhaps this moment isn't about closing a story, but about beginning a long-awaited chapter. One that's been written in silence, waiting for the right time. And so we return to the last phrase on Malachy's list. The most talked about line, the one that follows all the rest. Petrus Romanus. Peter the Roman. Just those two words have stirred generations of questions. Who is this final shepherd? What will his mission look like? Will he be a man named Peter? Or is the name something more, something deeper? Some believe it's a call to return, to go back to the roots of the Church in Rome. To rediscover the simple courage of Saint Peter himself, the fisherman turned apostle, the one who walked with Christ and later died for him. Perhaps Peter the Roman isn't just one man, but a reflection of a mission, one that leads the Church not to a finish line, but back to its foundation. What makes Saint Malachy's prophecy even more intriguing is how, looking back, some of the symbolic titles he gave to past popes seem to line up in remarkable ways. Take Pope Urban III, for example. Malachy's phrase for him was ex undarum rosa, which roughly means, from the lily and the rose. At first glance, it sounds poetic. But then you learn that Urban had strong family ties to Florence, a city whose emblem is the fleur de lis, a stylized lily long associated with purity, nobility, and even the Virgin Mary. Then there's the case of Pope John Paul II. His symbolic title was De Labor Solis, which translates as from the labor of the sun, or more mysteriously, of the eclipse of the sun. Now here's where it gets interesting. John Paul II was born on May 18, 1920, the same day a partial solar eclipse took place. Even more astonishing, when he passed away in April 2005, another solar eclipse occurred. To believers, these aren't just curious details, they feel like confirmations. As if a hidden thread of divine timing has always been quietly at work. But perhaps the deeper meaning behind Malachy's list isn't found just in these poetic matches. Some scholars suggest the prophecy doesn't only describe individual popes, it might also trace the spiritual journey of the Church itself. A journey of light and shadow, of peace and struggle, always moving, always returning to its foundation, Christ. For over 2,000 years, the Church has faced waves of renewal and periods of intense testing. Every generation brings new questions, sometimes theological, other times cultural or political. And yet, the Church stands. Not because of human strength, but because of a promise made long ago. Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Rather than fixating on past scandals or failings, many today choose to focus on something stronger, the Church's ability to rise again, to reform, to find its way back to the heart of the gospel. And this resilience doesn't come from documents or buildings. It comes from saints, men and women who have lived the faith with bravery, compassion, and deep joy. Their example has always outweighed the storms. Now, Pope Leo XIV carries that legacy forward. Not alone, but as part of a sacred chain that reaches all the way back to Saint Peter. His role is not to chase a prophecy, but to guide souls with wisdom, patience, and humility in a time that feels uncertain for many. And in his short time as Pope, he's already shown signs of a quiet but steady strength, a man who listens deeply, who leads with grace, and who is deeply rooted in Catholic tradition. Still, the question remains: what does Peter the Roman really mean? Could it be less about a name or place, and more about a calling? A return to the essence of the papacy, not as a throne of power, but as a mission of service. A return to the shepherd's path. Feeding the sheep. Walking with the forgotten. Preaching not from palaces, but from the places where people suffer and hope. If that's the true meaning, then maybe the prophecy isn't about the end of time at all. Maybe it's a call to wake up spiritually, to find simplicity again, unity again, holiness again. And as debates continue and interpretations vary, one truth remains unshaken. Saint Malachy's vision, whether symbolic or literal, still speaks. It still invites. It still stirs hearts to look upward, to look inward, and to remember that the Church is not just a structure. It's a living family, a global body of faith held together, not by fear, but by hope in Christ. In that light, the name Peter the Roman becomes something else. Not a sign of doom, but a guiding flame. A reminder to return to the beginning. To trust. To believe. To walk again in the footsteps of the first shepherd, the man who stood beside a lake and heard Jesus ask, "Do you love me?" And when he answered yes, Jesus gave him just one command: feed my sheep. And so, as the world turns its gaze to this new papacy, as Pope Leo XIV begins his mission, the final phrase of the prophecy lingers like a half-whispered line from a song not yet finished. It's part mystery, part mirror. For many, the timing feels like more than chance. It feels like something coming together. Not an ending. A convergence. If the phrase Peter the Roman is more symbolic than literal, as many scholars now believe, then the real question becomes: what is it pointing us toward? To find that answer, we have to go beyond dates and poetic lines. We have to ask something deeper. What would it mean for the Church to truly return to its roots? What would it look like for the successor of Peter to embrace not power, but purpose, not as a ruler in robes of splendor, but as a servant, walking quietly beside the wounded, the forgotten, and the seeking? Saint Malachy's final phrase may not be naming a man, it may be naming a mission. The name Peter reminds us of the rock-solid, unshakable on which Christ built his church. And the word Roman calls back to the deep roots of the Catholic identity, grounded in the apostles, tied to the eternal city that has seen it all: glory, persecution, rebuilding, and grace. Together, Peter the Roman might not be a prediction of a specific person, but a signpost pointing the Church back to its foundation. Not in nostalgia, but in renewal. And now, Pope Leo XIV steps into history at a time when that renewal feels not only possible, but deeply needed. Yes, the Church is still growing, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But in other parts of the world where once faith was strong, a quiet weariness has settled in. The fast pace of life, rising secularism, and the rise of individualism have left even faithful hearts feeling distant or distracted. In times like this, the voice of a shepherd must do more than lead institutions, it must heal hearts. Because at its core, the Church is not a structure, it is a sanctuary. It's not about authority, it's about conversion. And maybe that is the heart of the prophecy. Maybe the final pope isn't a signal of the end, but a call to return. A quiet voice reminding the faithful to come back to the center, to come home. With Pope Leo XIV, that return feels like it's already beginning. Not through bold speeches or sweeping changes, but through his way of being. Early on, he turned heads by rejecting signs of grandeur, choosing instead a path of simplicity. When he asked the people to bless him before he blessed them, it wasn't just humble, it was deeply meaningful. His leadership is not built on appearance, it's built on purpose. Some theologians say this moment feels like a pause before a deeper movement, like a Benedictine silence before a Franciscan wind. Others describe it as the beginning of a new season, a Marian age marked by purity, humility, and quiet trust in God's timing. However you frame it, many agree that something is shifting. Not outwardly, inwardly. A pruning, yes, but also a time of new fruit. Just like a living body, the Church moves through seasons, times of growth, followed by moments of deep reflection. In the past, these moments were led by saints like Benedict, Francis of Assisi, and Teresa of Avila. They didn't shout louder than the world. They simply lived the gospel so clearly that even non-believers couldn't ignore the light they carried. Could Pope Leo XIV be such a figure? It's still too early to say. But his actions already speak with quiet clarity. He avoids controversy and chooses communion. He holds firm to timeless truths, but also listens to the questions people carry today. And this is where Peter the Roman becomes more than just a line from a dusty manuscript. It becomes a mirror, a challenge, a call. It invites the Church to remember who she really is, a family defined not by status, but by service. A people known not for structures, but for love. A people who feed the hungry, welcome the outsider, and kneel beside the broken. The early Church had no cathedrals, no Vatican, no fame. And yet, it changed the world not with armies, but with mercy. Not with control, but with compassion. Not with politics, but with prayer. It stood against empires not by protest, but by presence. And it didn't win people through pressure, but through lives so transformed by Christ that no one could deny the power of grace. That spirit, that is what Peter the Roman might truly mean. Not one man, a movement. Not the end of the Church, but the end of everything unnecessary. What remains? The essentials. The gospel. The sacraments. The call to love without limits. And if that's true, then the final pope isn't a figure to fear. He is a figure of faithfulness. He isn't the last because the Church is dying. He may be the one leading us to what really matters most. He is called the last, not because something is ending, but because something ancient is being reborn. Under the quiet leadership of Pope Leo XIV, we may be witnessing a Church that becomes smaller in numbers but stronger in soul. A Church that lets go of applause, influence, and popularity to embrace once more the Beatitudes. To be poor in spirit, hungry for righteousness, merciful, gentle, and pure of heart. A Church that speaks less loudly, yet shines more clearly. This is not an age of final chapters. It is an age of foundations. And when we see it through that lens, Peter the Roman is not a warning, it's a question. It asks each one of us, are we ready to return? Not to comfort, but to the cross. Are we ready to stop rebuilding walls and start rebuilding altars in our hearts? Because the true Church has never been about brick and stone. It's built on people, on those who give their lives in love, who surrender their souls in prayer, who live quietly and faithfully in the hidden places of the world. And perhaps that's what the final line of Saint Malachy's prophecy means most of all. That when the written list ends, the unwritten mission begins not in the hands of one man, but in the hearts of many. Maybe Pope Leo XIV is the shepherd Malachy saw not because of policy or politics, but because of his presence. Because he reminds the Church not of what it does, but of who she is. And in a world filled with constant noise, such a reminder doesn't just feel timely, it feels sacred. In the days and weeks after Pope Leo's election, something unexpected began to happen. Not in the halls of the Vatican, but in quiet corners around the world. There were no headlines, no grand speeches from balconies, no sweeping reforms rolled out. And yet something was stirring. A stillness. A movement. Like the wind of something holy blowing gently across the soul of the Church. It began, as sacred things often do, with a simple act. The morning after his election, Pope Leo chose not to be driven. Instead, he walked alone, and without cameras, through the cobbled streets of Rome to a small chapel to pray. He didn't make a speech. He didn't call attention to himself. But the image of a white-robed figure walking quietly under the Roman sky said more than 1,000 words. That moment didn't trend. It didn't flash across breaking news. But it whispered. It whispered of humility. Of a leader who begins not with orders, but with prayer. And for many, that silent walk felt like the first breath of something sacred returning. Slowly, people began to notice, not with headlines, but with awe. Not with debates, but with stillness. Across the globe, the faithful leaned in not to hear something new, but to feel something old come alive again. In Manila, a group of university students began meeting weekly, opening the ancient texts of the early church fathers, stirred by the Pope's quiet encouragement to seek wisdom from the past. In Buenos Aires, a humble parish priest stood at the altar with tears in his eyes, telling his congregation that Pope Leo reminded him of the pastors from his youth men who were gentle, firm, and faithful to the very end. And in small towns across Europe and North America, where church doors had quietly remained closed or where pews had long sat empty, something unexpected happened. People began to return, not out of spectacle, not because of viral videos or modern campaigns, but because of sincerity. Something in the way this new pope carried himself made them pause. Look again. Listen again. It wasn't what he said that moved them. It was how he lived. His silence spoke louder than many voices. His humility carried weight. His presence echoed something ancient, something many had longed to see again. In just a short time, the papacy of Pope Leo XIV had already begun to reflect a deeper truth. A mirror held up to the hearts of the faithful. It wasn't novelty people were searching for. It was nearness. In an age flooded with constant noise and algorithms shaping every word we see, there now stands a man who speaks in silence. A pope whose voice is not raised through policies, but through parables. A leader whose authority doesn't come from headlines, but from stillness, the kind of stillness that can only come from someone who knows what it means to be invisible to the world, yet fully known by God. And maybe that's what gives new weight to Saint Malachy's prophecy. Because if Peter the Roman was never meant to describe a literal man, but instead to reveal a kind of leadership, a return to the Church's apostolic spirit, then perhaps the fulfillment isn't in Leo XIV as a person, but in the path he invites the Church to walk. His choice to live not in the ornate papal apartments, but in a humble residence among other priests wasn't just about comfort. It was about communion. A deliberate decision to dwell with, not above. It was a wordless message that the Church's power doesn't come from its palaces, but from its tables. From the places where the hungry are fed, the lonely embraced, and the grieving quietly held. Even his first encyclical carried that spirit. Titled Lux in Silentio, Light in Silence, Pope Leo wrote not with alarm, but with clarity. He offered no warnings, no condemnations. Instead, he reflected on the forgotten value of contemplation in a world moving too fast to breathe. He asked Catholics everywhere to create sacred space in their daily lives, to let ordinary moments become prayer. To light candles not just in churches, but in the depths of their hearts. And something began to happen. Not suddenly, not loudly, but deeply. Monasteries started reporting more vocations. Quiet chapels of Eucharistic adoration began to fill, even in the busiest cities. Young adults formed small groups not to debate doctrine, but to read scripture together, slowly, prayerfully. There was no media push, no viral trend, and yet the Church was beginning to breathe again. Still, amid this quiet renewal, the old question remained. What does Saint Malachy's prophecy mean now? Is Pope Leo truly the last pope, as some suggest? Or have we misunderstood the prophecy all along? Maybe it was never about predicting disaster. Maybe it was always a kind of parable, less about timelines and more about truth. A reminder not of the Church's end, but of its destiny. A destiny rooted not in power, but in presence. Not in fear, but in faith. If that's the case, then Pope Leo XIV isn't a final figure, he's a compass. A quiet symbol not of conclusion, but of purification. Not of collapse, but of clarity. And as more begin to see that, the conversation is shifting. It's no longer about panic. It's about purpose. It's not about decoding ancient Latin. It's about living with ancient love. The Church, in this view, is not a fortress. It's a family. Not a system, but a sanctuary. Not a relic of history, but a light in the present darkness. During a homily on the second Sunday of Easter, Pope Leo said something that stayed in the hearts of many. The world does not need us to predict the future. It needs us to be faithful in the present. If we do that, the future will take care of itself. And perhaps that is the secret behind the phrase Peter the Roman. Not a map for what's next, but a mirror showing us who we are called to become. If the Church can remember that if it can stay rooted in humility, truth, and prayer, then perhaps the prophecy was never about what ends, but about what lasts. And across the world, in every time zone, in every language, the question continues to rise. In incense-filled chapels and living rooms lit by whispered prayer, the faithful are asking, what does it mean to speak of the last pope? Is it a warning, a signal, or something else entirely? Perhaps it's an invitation. An invitation to look at the heart of the Church again, not with fear, but with focus. Since Pope Leo's elevation, that question has found its way into countless conversations. In Nairobi's seminaries, in Krakow's cobblestone churches, in the lecture halls of Rome and the candlelit corners of Guadeloupe. Everywhere, the name Peter the Roman is being spoken again, not as a dark omen, but as a riddle worth pondering. In the West, where the Church has wrestled for decades with cultural shifts and secular winds, many have come to see the prophecy differently. Not as a prophecy of ruin, but as an invitation. An invitation to strip away what's no longer essential. To be pruned not to die, but to grow. For them, the final pope is not a harbinger of destruction, but a bridge. A shepherd leading not into silence, but into something sacred and new. Where the old truths of the gospel awaken hearts weary of noise and novelty. And across the flourishing parishes of Africa and Asia, where the Church is young and vibrant, the prophecy is seen through a different lens. It's not feared, it's explored. It doesn't signal an end, it points to the universality of the faith. A pope not tied to one land, but a man who belongs to all. And Pope Leo XIV, with his pastoral background that spans continents, with his fluency in both Spanish and English, with his deep connection to Latin American spirituality, feels, to many, like the perfect reflection of that hope. In a world overwhelmed by constant noise, quick opinions, and algorithms deciding what we hear, one man leads differently. Pope Leo XIV doesn't command attention with loud words or sweeping declarations. He teaches with stillness. He leads not through programs or policies, but through parables, simple truths that echo the gospel. His voice is quiet, but it carries the kind of peace that comes from being unseen by the world, yet deeply seen by God. And maybe that's what brings new meaning to the ancient prophecy of Saint Malachy. Because if Peter the Roman was never meant to be a literal name, if it was meant instead to describe a spirit, a return to something forgotten, then perhaps it's not Leo XIV as a man who fulfills it, but the road he is inviting the Church to walk once more. His decision to live in a modest guest house among other clergy, instead of the grand papal apartments, wasn't just about comfort. It was a quiet declaration. A choice to live with others, not above them. A reminder that the Church's strength isn't in marble halls or golden ceilings, but in humble places. At shared tables. In small acts of mercy. In the quiet rooms where the broken are comforted, the hungry are fed, and the forgotten are remembered. That same spirit showed in his first encyclical, titled Light in Silence. Pope Leo didn't open with crisis or warnings. He opened with calm, with an invitation to breathe. In a world running fast and burning out, he asked people of faith to slow down, to create quiet places in their lives, to turn simple routines into sacred rituals, to pray not only with words, but with presence, to light candles not only in churches, but in their hearts. And something began to shift. Not in headlines, but in hearts. Monasteries quietly reported new vocations. Adoration chapels, once still, began to glow with silent worshippers. In busy cities, small groups of young people began gathering not for debate, but to open the scriptures with devotion. No ad campaign made it happen. No trend pushed it forward. But something ancient was waking up again. Even in this peaceful renewal, the question lingered. What did Saint Malachy mean? Is Pope Leo really the final pope? Or have we missed the prophecy's real purpose all along? Maybe it was never meant to scare. Maybe it was never about predicting destruction. Maybe it was a kind of parable, a quiet story reminding us not of what's ending, but of what endures. If that's true, then Pope Leo is not a sign of closure. He's a compass. A quiet leader helping the Church find its center again. Not through fear, but through faith. And so, the conversation is changing. It's no longer filled with anxiety. It's filled with focus. It's not about decoding ancient texts. It's about becoming the church we were always meant to be, not a fortress, but a family. Not a machine, but a sanctuary. Not something stuck in the past, but a living light in the present moment. In one of his first homilies, Pope Leo said something that stayed with many. The world doesn't need us to predict the future. It needs us to be faithful right now. If we can do that, the future will take care of itself. Maybe Peter the Roman isn't a roadmap, it's a mirror. It reflects the kind of people we're called to become. And if the church can stay rooted in humility, in truth, in prayer, then maybe the prophecy isn't about what fades away. It's about what remains. And so, across every continent, in whispered prayers and quiet chapels, people are still asking, what does it really mean to speak of the last pope? Is it the end? A warning? Or something much deeper? Maybe it's a question meant to draw us closer to the heart of the church, to make us pause and listen. Since Pope Leo's election, that question has echoed everywhere, from seminaries in Nairobi to churches in Krakow, from lecture halls in Rome to the candlelit corners of Guadeloupe. And wherever it's asked, the phrase Peter the Roman is no longer heard as a threat. It's being seen as an invitation. In the West, where the church has faced deep cultural shifts and waves of change, many are beginning to understand the prophecy differently. Not as a sign of collapse, but of cleansing. Not the end of the tree, but a pruning that helps it grow stronger. To these believers, the final pope doesn't mark a fall. He becomes a bridge, a shepherd who leads not into fear, but into renewal. A time when tired hearts rediscover timeless truths. When the gospel, stripped of excess, becomes fresh again. And in places like Africa and Asia, where the church continues to thrive with passion and youth, the prophecy inspires not dread, but interest. It's not taken literally. It's seen as a symbol. A reminder that the Pope doesn't just belong to Rome, but to the world. A shepherd who reflects every voice, every soul, every culture. And Pope Leo XIV, with his life shaped by mission work, his Spanish and English flowing easily, and his heart rooted in Latin American spirituality, has come to embody that very idea. To many, he doesn't just fit the prophecy. He fulfills the hope behind it. Even in the digital world, where faith can sometimes feel fractured, debated, or distorted, a quiet kind of content has begun to appear. Not loud debates or flashy soundbites, but gentle glimpses of something real. Short videos. Wordless reels. Moments where Pope Leo XIV is seen blessing a disabled child, pausing in prayer at the grave of a forgotten saint, or simply exchanging kind words with workers in the street. These clips aren't shared with commentary. They're shared in silence. As if the viewers understand that no words are needed, that words might even get in the way. One young father from Argentina posted a video titled, "He reminds me of my grandpa." It showed the Pope tying his shoe during a public event next to an old home video of his grandfather doing the same. The caption said it simply, "This isn't about power, it's about presence. That's what we need." And maybe that's the key. Pope Leo doesn't chase influence. He earns trust. In a world that shouts, his voice soothes. In a time obsessed with speed, his slower pace invites others to pause. He doesn't try to control the future, he stands rooted in something eternal. And because of that, people are starting to move with him. Even those who had long left the church are finding their way back. In Australia, a man who hadn't stepped inside a church in 15 years returned, not because of a homily, but because of a single line the Pope had spoken in passing. The church is not only where we celebrate joy, but where we are allowed to cry. That one sentence broke through. "I didn't think anyone in the church saw my grief," the man later said. But he did. Moments like these remind us that holiness doesn't always look like ceremony or splendor. Sometimes it looks like kindness. Sometimes it sounds like silence. Sometimes it simply feels like being seen. Without trying to, Pope Leo is becoming a mirror for millions, a mirror that reflects what faith can feel like again. Not a burden, but a breath. Not fear, but freedom. He hasn't reinvented the church. He has quietly reintroduced her as a place not of rules first, but of rest. And people are responding. Not because they were told to, but because they've seen something in him that speaks to what their hearts had forgotten. In this light, the phrase Peter the Roman begins to shine with a new kind of meaning. Perhaps the final pope is not the last in a line, but the first in a return. Perhaps the prophecy isn't about collapse, but about resurrection. A rising of what had been buried. The courage of the early martyrs, the faith of fishermen, the open arms of a church that calls every soul by name. And if that's true, then the real prophecy isn't written in Latin or marble, it's written in lives. Quiet lives. Faithful lives. Unseen acts of love that begin again each morning with a prayer. Lives that now, inspired by Pope Leo, believe again that even the smallest gesture can touch eternity. As the early months of his papacy unfold, something new yet ancient is settling into the rhythm of the Church. Not a rhythm set by calendars or official schedules, but something deeper. A spiritual recalibration. A stillness beneath the noise. Not a call to crowds, but a whisper to the conscience. And in that stillness, a question continues to surface. Have we misunderstood what it meant for the prophecy to reach its final line? Saint Malachy's list was never meant to be a game of predictions. Yet for centuries, it stirred the hearts of the faithful. Line after line, a quiet thread weaving through time. Now, with the final phrase Peter the Roman standing alone, the question is not only what does it mean, but what does it ask of us? Because if that final line wasn't meant to create fear, but to restore focus, then maybe its fulfillment isn't found in a title, but in a transformation. Maybe the prophecy finds its meaning in the way the Church rediscovers her identity through him. And this is where Pope Leo XIV, whether or not he's the one Malachy envisioned, begins to echo the spirit of the prophecy. He doesn't command attention. He doesn't dress in grandeur. His words are simple. His presence is steady. And yet, in that simplicity, many are reminded of Saint Peter himself. A man who fell, but got up again. A man changed not by strength, but by grace. Already, Leo has begun to shift the Church's focus not through policies, but through posture. He speaks of the Church not as a fortress to be defended, but as a field hospital for the wounded. He calls priests to be more present, families to be more prayerful, institutions to be more human. He doesn't reject tradition. He returns to it not to preserve it in a museum, but to let it breathe again. And the people are noticing. In parishes long quiet, mass attendance is beginning to stir again. Not in overwhelming numbers yet, but in spirit. Parents who used to glance at their watches now linger after liturgy. Children are asking questions about saints again, not as distant legends, but as companions. Catechists are receiving messages from teens who want to volunteer, not because they were asked to, but because something about the way Pope Leo lives has made them curious about holiness. Not louder, just clearer. Not newer, just truer. This isn't a revival fueled by emotion. It's a quiet return, built on encounter one person at a time. It doesn't come with trumpets or flashing lights, but with footsteps. Soft ones, steady ones. And still, the wider world watches and wonders. Will Pope Leo XIV change church doctrine? Will he shock us with bold reforms? Will he challenge or conserve? But maybe those questions miss the heart of what's really happening. Because what is unfolding now isn't a shift in rules, but a shift in rhythm. Not new declarations, but renewed devotion. A return to the gospel not in polished language, but in its raw, radiant simplicity. A return to the tenderness of the Last Supper. The trembling bravery of the first martyrs. The fire of Pentecost, which did not begin in texts, but in hearts set ablaze. That's why this moment feels so full, so strangely familiar. It's as if, through the quiet walk of Pope Leo, the Church is remembering herself. Not her image, her purpose. Not her structure, her soul. And the prophecy once feared by many begins to feel like something else entirely. Less like a warning, more like a reflection. A mirror, held up not to frighten, but to focus. Not to signal the end, but to guide us back to the beginning. To the shores of Galilee. To the hillside teachings. To the table where bread was broken and eyes were opened. And if Pope Leo is, in some way, a reflection of Peter the Roman, then perhaps Saint Malachy's final line wasn't about a moment of destruction, but of direction. Not the closing of a door, but the unlocking of an ancient one. A leader not towering above, but walking beside. Not crowned in grandeur, but clothed in grace. The world still turns. Uncertainty still lingers. But in little places, village parishes, bustling cities, family kitchens, schoolyards, a whisper moves. Something ancient. Something alive. A breath of hope in the quiet. Not because someone declared the end is near, but because someone quietly reminded us what the church was always meant to be. To love. To serve. To witness. And in rediscovering that, the last line of the prophecy stops feeling like a conclusion. It begins to feel like a doorway waiting to open. So as the speculation fades and the rhythm of ordinary church life resumes, we're not left with grand finality. We're left with something far more powerful, a decision. The prophecy of Saint Malachy, for all its mystery and allure, doesn't demand we look forward in fear. It invites us to look inward with honesty, to ask where we are, who we've become, and what we're called to be now. Whether or not Pope Leo fulfills the last line of a centuries-old list doesn't really matter in the end, because he's become something far greater, a mirror. A reflection of the Church's soul at a time when she needed to see herself clearly again. His papacy, still in its early days, isn't defined by upheaval or revolution. It's defined by reorientation, a gentle turning back. A soft, sacred reawakening of what it means to walk with Christ, not apart from the world, but within it. And maybe that's what Saint Malachy saw. Not a dramatic final act, but a final invitation. An invitation to return. Not to doctrine alone, but to devotion. Not to hierarchy, but to humility. Not to noise, but to nearness. To God. To each other. In the soft steps of Pope Leo XIV, the Church is beginning to find a new rhythm. It doesn't rush. It doesn't panic. It listens. And in that listening, something beautiful is rising. Parents leading prayer in their homes again. Teenagers discovering meaning in silence. Priests rediscovering the sacred joy of the sacraments. Artists painting with purpose. Elders realizing their prayers still move mountains. Children watching a man in white and wondering not what it means to be powerful, but what it means to be good. This is the quiet miracle already taking place. The prophecy, it seems, has done its work. Not by pointing us to an ending, but by preparing us for a beginning. Not through certainty, but surrender. Not through fear, but through faith. And now, in the heart of Rome, beneath the ancient dome of St. Peter's Basilica, a shepherd prays. Quietly, simply, without applause, as the world watches, and somewhere deep in the soul of the Church, an old truth whispers again. The rock still stands.